At 67 years old, Eleanor Vance sat in a chair that cost more than her first house and listened to her son Julian explain why she no longer owned her life. But what Julian and his father Robert didn't know, what they were too blinded by their own spreadsheets to see, is that the most valuable thing Eleanor owned was the one thing they had already written off as worthless. Stay with us to witness how a forgotten lighthouse on a crumbling cliff and a silver compass with a cracked glass face became the keys to a justice that the Vance family never saw coming. If you've ever worked for decades to build a dream, only to see someone else's name put on the front door, if you've felt the cold sting of a child's greed masking itself as concern, or if you've stood at the edge of your life with nothing but the clothes on your back, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because the moment Eleanor turns the rusted key in that lighthouse door, you will realize that the world often underestimates a woman who has already survived everything. Eleanor sat perfectly still in the boardroom of Vance Construction. The air in the room smelled of expensive cologne and the ozone from the high-end air purifiers. She looked at her hands. Her knuckles were swollen from years of typing ledgers and filing the heavy paper records that had built this company from a single truck into a regional empire. She remembered 1984 as if the smell of the pine trees was still in the room. She had been 31 years old when she sold the 50 acres of timberland her father had left her. She had taken the check for $12,000 and placed it in Robert's hands while they stood in their cramped kitchen. She had told him it was the seed for their future. He had bought a flatbed truck and a set of professional ladders. For the next 40 years, she had been the silent engine of the company. She ran the billing department from a card table in the hallway, while Julian played with wooden blocks at her feet. She stayed up until 2 in the morning to balance the books because they couldn't afford a second salary. When the company finally moved into this glass tower, she moved into a windowless office in the back. She never drew a paycheck. Robert told her it was better for their tax bracket. She believed him because she thought they were building a legacy for their son. She had sewed her own curtains for their first 3 houses to save every penny for the payroll taxes. She had skipped 5 family vacations to ensure the crews got their Christmas bonuses during the lean years. Now, she looked across the mahogany table at the 2 men she had sacrificed everything for. Robert wouldn't look at her. He was busy adjusting the knot of his silk tie. Julian was leaning back in his chair. He had his phone out and was answering an email. He didn't even look up when he spoke. "We're just being realistic, Mum," Julian said. His voice was smooth and clinical. "At your age, you can't be expected to manage the stress of the restructuring." Eleanor felt the small weight of the silver compass in her coat pocket. It was a merchant marine's compass her father had given her when she was 6. The glass face was cracked across the center. The needle always trembled before it found north. She rubbed her thumb over the cold metal through the fabric of her coat. "I built this office," Eleanor said quietly. Julian finally looked up from his phone. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "You were the bookkeeper, Mom. Let's not get sentimental." Robert cleared his throat and pushed a legal folder toward her. "We've made arrangements for your retirement, Eleanor." His voice was soft, the way a person speaks to someone who is confused. "We're worried about you living in the city alone. This is what's best for everyone," Julian added. He tapped a finger on the signature line of the final page. "It's a clean break. This is fair." Eleanor looked at the document. It was a total transfer of her beneficial interest in the family holding company. In exchange, she was being given a single property, the Blackwood Lighthouse. It was a decommissioned light station on a remote northern cliff. It hadn't been inhabited for 30 years. She knew the roof was gone. She knew the salt air had eaten the pipes. She looked at her husband. "You're taking the house in the city," Robert nodded. "It's too much for you to maintain, Eleanor. Julian needs the space for the new foundations he's setting up." Julian checked his watch and stood up. "I have a lunch meeting at 1. He didn't offer her a hug. He didn't offer her a ride home. He just picked up his phone and walked toward the door. Eleanor reached out and took the folder. Her fingers were shaking, but she didn't let them see. She stood up. Her knees felt like they were filled with dry sand. She walked toward the elevator. The silver compass was a heavy anchor in her pocket. She didn't look back. Eleanor Vance, 67 years old, stood in the lobby of the building she had helped design and felt the weight of her purse. It was lighter than it had been 40 years ago, when she only had a dream and 50 acres of timberland. She walked past the portraits of the board of directors. Robert's face looked back at her from a gold frame. He looked successful. He looked like a man who had built everything with his own 2 hands. Eleanor remembered the calluses on her own palms from the first 3 years of the company. She had been the one to drive the flatbed truck when the first hired hand quit without notice. She had worked 10-hour shifts on the road and then spent 4 hours at the kitchen table with a calculator. The timberland her father had left her had been her only security. It was a piece of the coast where the air smelled of salt and ancient cedar. She had sold it in a single afternoon because Robert told her they needed a warehouse to grow. She had signed the deed over to a developer and watched the trees fall. She didn't cry then because she thought she was planting a different kind of forest. She had managed the payroll for 200 men without a single error for 3 decades. When the company couldn't afford health insurance in 1992, she stayed up all night finding a way to restructure the debt. She had worn the same winter coat for 7 years so they could buy a second crane. She had skipped her own mother's 75th birthday celebration because the audit was due. She believed that every hour of her life was an investment in a family vault. She thought the vault was built on love. She found out today it was built on fine print. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city noise was a physical wall of sound. She reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet. She opened the leather flap and counted the bills. She had $42.12. There was a credit card in the slot, but she knew it was tied to the corporate account. She knew Julian had already deactivated it. She had watched him do it on his laptop while Robert was talking about fairness. She walked toward the bus stop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a notification from the bank. Her access to the joint savings account had been restricted. She didn't call Robert. She didn't text Julian. She knew the silence on the other end would be louder than the city traffic. She sat on the cold plastic bench and looked at the silver compass. The needle was spinning in circles. The magnetism of the underground subway lines was confusing the old instrument. She remembered her father telling her that a compass only works when you stand on solid ground. She realized she hadn't stood on solid ground in 40 years. She had been standing on the promises of men who viewed her as a line item. She looked at her phone again. The battery was at 12%. She didn't have a charger in her bag. She thought about the lighthouse. It was 6 hours away by bus. It was a pile of stone and broken glass. It was the only thing they couldn't take because the title was still in her maiden name. Her father had been careful about that one thing. Robert had tried to get her to transfer it a dozen times over the years. He said it was a liability. He said it was a drain on their taxes. She had held on to it because it was the last place she remembered being Eleanor Miller. Before she became the bookkeeper, before she became the wife who didn't need a salary. The bus pulled up to the curb. The brakes hissed like a warning. Eleanor stood up and felt the ache in her lower back. It was a sharp, biting pain that radiated down her left leg. It was the result of 40 years of sitting in chairs that weren't designed for her. She climbed the steps and handed the driver her last $20 bill. He didn't look at her face. He just handed her the change and a paper ticket. She found a seat in the back. The window was smeared with grime. She watched the glass tower of Vance Construction disappear behind a row of grey warehouses. She was 67 years old, and she was starting over with a pocket full of change. She leaned her head against the vibrating glass. She didn't look back. Eleanor Vance sat at the end of the long mahogany table and watched the sun set behind the skyline she had helped build. The boardroom was silent except for the hum of the climate control system and the rhythmic tapping of Julian's fingers on his glass desk. Robert sat to her right, his hands folded neatly over a stack of blue-bound legal folders. The light through the floor-to-ceiling windows turned the water in their crystal glasses a deep, bruising purple. "It's a simple matter of restructuring, Eleanor," Robert said. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the gold fountain pen in his hand. "The company needs to be agile for the new merger, and your name on the title creates a liability we can't afford." He pushed a single sheet of paper toward her. It was a quitclaim deed for their primary residence, the 5-bedroom colonial where she had raised Julian. Beside it sat a second document, a resignation form from her position as treasurer. "We're worried about your stress levels, Mom," Julian said. He picked up a silver spoon and began to stir a cup of espresso that was already cold. "At 67, you should be focused on your garden, not the quarterly audits." He didn't look worried. He looked at his reflection in the polished wood of the table. "This is what's best for everyone," Robert added. His voice was a practiced velvet. "We're not being cruel, Eleanor. We're being practical." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, heavy iron key attached to a piece of driftwood. He slid it across the table until it touched her knuckles. "You always said you missed the sound of the ocean." Eleanor looked at the key. She looked at Julian, who was currently scrolling through a real estate app on his phone. He was looking at penthouses in the city center. He was already moving into a future that didn't include her. "I sold my father's land to pay the first 6 months of our mortgage, Robert," Eleanor said. Her voice was a dry rasp in the quiet room. Robert gave a thin, tight smile, and that was a lovely gesture. 40 years ago. Julian looked up then, his eyes sharp and devoid of the concern he had been performing. "Let's be honest, Mom. You were the help with a wedding ring." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt a coldness settle into her marrow that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She picked up the pen. The ink felt heavy, like lead. She signed the first document, then the second, the family home to the holding company, the investment accounts to Julian, the 40-year legacy to the corporate shredder. While they exchanged victorious glances and checked their watches for dinner reservations, Eleanor received what they called the Piece of the Coast, a rusted iron key, and the deed to a ruin on a cliff that no one had seen in 3 decades. "There's a bus at 6, Julian said. He didn't look up from his phone again. He was already planning how to renovate her bedroom into a home cinema. "We'll have your personal items sent to the village post office by the end of the week." Robert stood up and adjusted his jacket. "You'll be so much more comfortable there, Eleanor." He didn't offer her a hand to help her stand. He didn't walk her to the door. He simply walked to the window and began to describe the new logo to his son. Eleanor stood, her legs feeling like brittle glass. She tucked the iron key into her pocket next to her father's silver compass. The room was already forgetting her presence. She walked to the door. The heavy oak clicked shut behind her. Eleanor stood in the center of the foyer of the house on Crestview Drive. The walls were already bare. Julian's movers had worked fast while she was at the office. The rectangular shadows where the family portraits had hung looked like bruises on the white paint. Barnaby, a 12-year-old border collie with a grey muzzle and a permanent limp, sat by the front door. He watched Eleanor with milky, patient eyes. He didn't whine. He didn't move toward his empty water bowl. He simply waited for the only person who had never forgotten to feed him. Eleanor pulled her phone from her pocket. The battery icon was a thin red sliver. She opened her messages. The last text was from 3 days ago. It was a reminder from her dentist about a cleaning she could no longer afford. There were no messages from the women in her bridge club. There was nothing from the neighbors who had borrowed her silver punch bowl for their daughter's wedding. The digital silence felt heavier than the empty house. She looked at her banking app one last time. The screen flickered and showed a balance of $0. Robert had been thorough. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her small leather coin purse. She emptied it onto the marble countertop. 2 $20 bills, 2 singles, a dime and 2 pennies. She had $42.12 left in the world. The security system on the wall beeped. A small red light began to flash. It was a reminder that her access code would expire at midnight. Her son had been very clear about the timeline. Eleanor looked at Barnaby. "It's just us, old man," she whispered. The sound of her own voice startled her. She reached into her other pocket and felt the silver compass. She pulled it out and held it in the dim light of the foyer. The needle swung wildly before settling. It pointed toward the front door. It pointed north, toward the coast. She thought about the Blackwood Lighthouse. She remembered the way the salt air felt like a physical weight on her skin. She remembered her father's rough hands as he polished the brass housing of the great lens. She had nowhere else to go. She had no friends who would risk Robert's corporate wrath by taking her in. She had no family who didn't already answer to Julian. She picked up the single suitcase she had been allowed to pack. She clipped the leash to Barnaby's collar. The dog stood up slowly, his joints clicking in the quiet room. He leaned his weight against her leg for a brief moment. Eleanor took a breath and stepped over the threshold. The heavy front door clicked shut. She didn't look back. The bus dropped Eleanor and Barnaby at the edge of a gravel road that the map didn't acknowledge. The sky over Blackwood Bay was the color of a bruised plum. Rain began to fall in thin, cold needles that found the gaps in Eleanor's wool coat. She stood on the shoulder of the road with her single suitcase and felt the vibration of the departing bus in the soles of her feet. Barnaby huffed and shook his coat, his damp fur smelling of old wool and wet pavement. "We walk now," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded thin against the roar of the Atlantic, hidden behind the tree line. They walked toward the village center, a cluster of buildings that looked like they were huddling together for warmth. There was a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a diner with yellowed, checkered curtains. Eleanor stopped in front of a general store with a faded red awning that whipped in the wind. A bell chimed as she pushed the heavy wooden door open. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, peppermint, and floor wax. An old man with a face like a topographical map looked up from a stack of newspapers. He wore a thick flannel shirt and a pair of spectacles held together with a bit of copper wire. He went perfectly still when he saw Eleanor. He didn't ask if she was lost. He didn't ask what she was doing with a suitcase and an old dog in a storm. "Arthur Miller's girl," he said. His voice was a low growl of recognition. Eleanor froze with her hand still on the door handle. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she said. The man nodded slowly and walked around the counter. "You have your father's eyes and your mother's stubborn chin, Eleanor Miller." He held out a hand that was calloused and dry. "I'm Elias. I was the apprentice at the boatyard when your father ran the light." He looked at the suitcase and then back at her face. "We've been waiting for you to come home. We heard about the construction company and the city." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat that she couldn't swallow. "I don't think I'm the person you remember, Elias. People don't change as much as they think," he replied. He reached under the counter and pulled out a flashlight and a heavy wool blanket. "You'll need these. The light hasn't seen a fire in 30 years. He walked her to the door and pointed toward the north cliff path. "The path is narrow. Stay to the landward side. The sea is hungry tonight." Eleanor thanked him and stepped back out into the rain. The walk to the lighthouse took 40 minutes. Her knees began to throb with every step on the uneven stone path. The wind tried to push her toward the edge of the cliff, where the white foam of the waves looked like teeth in the dark. Then she saw it. The Blackwood Lighthouse stood like a jagged bone against the horizon. The white paint had been stripped away by decades of salt and sand. The glass gallery at the top was a hollow eye, broken and dark. The keeper's cottage was buried under a shroud of dead ivy and wild blackberry brambles. It looked worse than the photographs in the legal folder. It looked like a place where things went to be forgotten. Eleanor reached the iron gate. It was orange with rust and looked as though it would require a sledgehammer to open. She reached out and touched the latch. The gate swung inward with a silent, effortless grace. The hinges had been freshly greased. Eleanor stopped and looked at the dark cottage. She pulled the silver compass from her pocket. The needle, which had been spinning for hours, suddenly snapped to the north. It pointed directly at the heavy oak door of the house. A single light was reflecting in the one unbroken window pane. It wasn't a lamp or a fire. It was a beam of moonlight, hitting a brass plaque on the door. Eleanor stepped onto the porch. The wood didn't groan under her weight. She took the iron key from her pocket and slid it into the lock. The door opened. The cottage smelled of wet stone and 30 years of forgotten winters. Eleanor spent the first 3 days scrubbing the floors with a bucket of seawater and a stiff bristled brush. Her lower back burned with a dull, throbbing heat every time she stood up. Her knuckles were raw from the lye soap she had bought with her last few dollars in the village. She used a stack of old newspapers and a roll of duct tape to seal the cracks in the window frames. She found a heavy tarp in the garden shed and dragged it onto the kitchen roof. The weight of the wet plastic nearly pulled her off the ladder. She tied it down with a length of frayed nautical rope she found tangled in the ivy. Her daily routine became a series of small, exhausting victories. She woke up when the light hit the cracked lens of her father's compass on the nightstand. She walked Barnaby down the cliff path to the well for 2 buckets of water. She spent the afternoons gathering driftwood from the small cove below the lighthouse. She learned to start a fire with damp wood and a single match. By the end of the first week, her hands were covered in small nicks and deep-set splinters. On Tuesday afternoon, a man appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was tall and thin, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a fisherman's cap. He carried a thermos and a small loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. "I'm Silas," he said. He didn't ask why she was there or how long she planned to stay. He set the bread on the stone wall and looked up at the lighthouse tower. "The gallery glass is loose in the southwest corner," he said. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. "I noticed. The wind whistles through it like a flute." Silas sat on the porch step and poured 2 cups of tea. "I was a maritime attorney for 40 years before I retired to the village." He looked at her work-worn hands and the way she favored her left hip. "Your father used to say the light never went out because the house knew it was loved." Eleanor took the tea. The heat of the cup was the first kind thing she had felt in weeks. "I'm not sure if the house loves me, Silas. I think it's just testing me." Silas didn't reply. He stayed for 20 minutes, drinking his tea in a comfortable silence. He left the rest of the bread and walked back down the path without a word. That night, the storm came back with a vengeance. The wind shrieked against the lighthouse tower like a living thing. The tarp on the roof ripped free in the first hour of the gale. Water began to pour through the kitchen ceiling in a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. Eleanor sat on her narrow bed in the darkness. She looked at her phone. The screen remained black. She had charged it in the village, but there were no messages, no missed calls from Julian, no text from Robert asking if she had survived the trip. She realized they truly believed she would crawl back to them within a month. They thought she would beg for a room in the basement of the house she had paid for. A sharp pain shot through her arthritic right knee as she tried to shift her weight. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 67 years old with $20 and no strength left in my arms." The math of her survival was too large to look at directly. "This is where I die," she thought. "Not tonight, but in a month when the cold gets into my lungs. This is what being discarded looks like." She lay back and closed her eyes, listening to the rain flood her kitchen. Barnaby stood up from the rug and walked over to the bed. He didn't bark. He nudged her hand with his cold, wet nose. When she didn't move, he placed his heavy head on her chest. She felt the slow, steady beat of his heart through her sweater. She felt the vibration of his tail hitting the wooden bed frame. The dog refused to let her disappear into the dark. Eleanor opened her eyes. She saw the silver compass on the nightstand. A single flash of lightning hit the room. The needle wasn't spinning. It was locked toward the north wall of the cottage. It wasn't pointing toward the sea. It was pointing toward the fireplace. Eleanor sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed. "I'm not dying in this house," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm not dying because two men decided I was a line item they didn't need." She stood up and ignored the scream of pain in her knee. She grabbed her flashlight and a bucket. She walked into the flooded kitchen. She was still here. Eleanor knelt on the damp stones of the hearth. The flashlight beam shook in her hand, casting long, dancing shadows against the soot-stained chimney. She held the silver compass level in her left palm. The needle did not waver toward the sea or the magnetic pull of the coast. It pointed directly at a smooth river rock, set 3 rows up from the floor, distinct from the rough granite blocks around it. She reached out and pressed her thumb against the mortar. The grey material crumbled like dry bread under her touch. She felt a hollow space behind the stone. She stood and moved to the kitchen drawer, her knees popping in the quiet room. She returned with a dull butter knife and began to pick at the edges of the river rock. Barnaby sat beside her, his ears pricked and his tail giving a single, soft thump against the rug. The stone groaned as she pried it forward. It slid out 2 inches, then 4. Eleanor gripped the cold edges and pulled with both hands. The rock was heavier than it looked. It fell onto the braided rug with a muffled thud, sending a small cloud of grey dust into the air. Inside the wall was a small cavity lined with cedar wood. She reached into the dark space and felt the bite of cold metal. It was a galvanized steel box, the kind her father had used to protect ship's logs. She pulled it out and set it on the floor between her knees. The latch was stiff, fused by decades of damp air and neglect. She had to use the handle of the knife to hammer at the lock until the metal shrieked and gave way. Inside, wrapped in heavy green oilcloth, was a stack of legal folders. She pulled them out. Her fingers were trembling so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves. Her breath was shallow, a sharp whistle in her throat that she couldn't quite catch. She unfolded the first page. The paper was thick, ivory-colored, and yellowed at the edges. At the top, in her father's precise, slanted maritime script, were the words, "Founding Articles of Miller Vance Construction, 1984. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. She sat back on her heels, the paper fluttering in her hand. "Barnaby," she whispered. The dog tilted his head, watching her face. "He didn't just take my money," she said to the empty room. She looked at the signature line on the 3rd page. Her father had been the witness. The document stated that the initial $12,000 from the land sale was not a gift to her husband. It was a capital investment in a family trust. The trust named Eleanor Miller as the sole beneficial owner of all future assets and subsidiaries. Robert was listed as the managing director. He had never been the owner. There was a second document underneath the founding articles. It was a corporate resolution signed 20 years later, on the day they moved into the city house. It reaffirmed the terms of the original trust. Robert had signed it in front of a notary. He must have forgotten it existed, or he had assumed that when her father died, the only copy of the truth had died with him. Eleanor felt a strange, blooming heat rising in her chest. It wasn't the heat of anger. It was the weight of 40 years of lies finally lifting off her shoulders. She read the final clause aloud. This trust is irrevocable and cannot be dissolved without the express written consent of the beneficiary. She touched the silver compass. The needle was still locked toward the hearth. She understood now why her father had been so insistent about the lighthouse in his final days. He hadn't left her a ruin to hide in. He had left her a fortress. She stood up and walked to the kitchen window. The rain was still falling, but the darkness of the coast didn't look like a grave anymore. She held the oilcloth bundle against her chest. The math had changed. Eleanor used 12 of her remaining $20 to buy a gallon of white primer and a heavy-duty scrub brush from Elias. She spent the next 14 days clearing the ivy that had swallowed the cottage. The vines were as thick as a man's wrist and coated in decades of grey dust. She used a rusted pair of loppers she found in the garden shed. Her hands blistered within the first hour. She taped her fingers with electrical tape and kept cutting. By the end of the week, a massive pile of dead brown stalks sat at the edge of the cliff. The cottage emerged from the green shroud like a ghost. The granite stones were pale and speckled with orange lichen. Eleanor hauled buckets of seawater up the path to scrub the exterior walls. She used a mixture of sand and vinegar to lift the salt crust from the stone. The physical labor was a slow, grinding ache that settled into her hips by noon. She didn't stop to rest until her shadow stretched long across the grass. She spent the following week on the roof. She used a roll of heavy roofing felt she bartered from a local fisherman. In exchange, she spent 3 evenings organizing his chaotic fuel receipts and tax documents. She sat on the ridge of the cottage roof with a hammer in her hand. She tapped the galvanized nails into the wood with a steady, rhythmic precision. The smell of hot tar and salt air filled her lungs. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't think about the boardroom in the city. She focused on the half-inch of steel disappearing into the beam. Inside, she whitewashed the kitchen walls until the room felt twice its size. She found a stash of old linseed oil in the lighthouse workshop. She spent 3 days on her knees, rubbing the oil into the oak floorboards. The wood drank the oil and turned the color of golden honey. She replaced the broken window panes with glass she salvaged from an abandoned greenhouse. She used a putty knife to smooth the grey glazing into the frames. Her movements were slower than they had been 20 years ago, but they were more deliberate. She was no longer building a legacy for a man who didn't value her. She was building a shelter for the woman she had become. The lighthouse tower required the most work. The iron spiral stairs were coated in a thick layer of rust that flaked off like red skin. Eleanor used a wire brush to strip the metal back to its black bones. She climbed the 72 steps every morning with a bucket of soapy water. She spent 4 days cleaning the great Fresnel lens in the gallery. The glass was composed of hundreds of hand-cut prisms. She polished each one with a soft cotton rag and a spray of vinegar. Her arms felt like lead by the time she reached the final tier. When the sun hit the horizon that evening, the tower did something it hadn't done in 30 years. The lens caught the dying light and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. Rainbows danced across the white interior walls of the tower. The light spilled out across the dark water of the bay. The lighthouse didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a diamond set in the rough grey stone of the cliff. Eleanor stood on the gallery catwalk and felt the wind pull at her hair. She looked down at the cottage. The white primer was bright against the darkening sky. The roof was tight. The windows were whole. She went inside and placed the silver compass on the clean stone mantel. The glass face was still cracked, but the needle was steady. She didn't need it to tell her where she was. She was home. By the second month, the reflection in the polished glass of the lighthouse gallery was a woman Eleanor barely recognized. She stood on the catwalk and looked at her hands. The skin was tanned dark by the salt air and the constant wind. The swelling in her knuckles had subsided, replaced by a lean, corded strength in her forearms. She no longer felt like a collection of aches and medical reminders. She felt like an extension of the granite beneath her boots. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she walked into the small room at the base of the tower. She sat in her father's old wooden chair and looked at the empty space where his maritime charts used to hang. "I'm still here, Dad," she said. Her voice was steady and didn't echo. "I stopped counting the hours I gave to them. I started counting the stones I laid today." She felt a strange cooling sensation in her chest, as if a fever she had been carrying for 40 years had finally broken. It wasn't a grand epiphany. It was the physical feeling of a heavy wool coat being lifted from her shoulders on a hot day. She realized she was no longer waiting for a phone call that would never come. She was no longer checking the mailbox for an apology that Robert didn't have the courage to write. The community began to arrive at the edge of her property without an invitation. It started with Elias, who brought a basket of apples and a heavy-duty flashlight. He sat on the porch and told her stories about the day she was born during a gale. Then Mrs. Gable from the diner arrived with a dozen eggs and a request. She had heard Eleanor was a whiz with the numbers. She brought a shoebox filled with 3 years of disorganized receipts and tax notices. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a legal pad. She didn't charge for the work. She traded 3 hours of accounting for a bag of flour and a cured ham. By the following week, word had spread through the village. People didn't come to offer charity. They came because they needed the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years managing a multi-million-dollar construction empire. The local volunteer fire department brought their ledger. The lobster cooperative brought their fuel logs. Eleanor organized their lives while the lighthouse tower stood guard over the bay. She didn't feel like the help anymore. She felt like the spine of the village. One afternoon, Silas arrived with a portable typewriter and a stack of legal stationery. He didn't bring coffee this time. He brought a thick file from the county recorder's office. "The light is back on, Eleanor," he said, gesturing to the tower, "but the paperwork is still in the dark." He sat at her golden oak table and began to explain the process of filing a corporate injunction. He showed her how the founding articles she found in the hearth were a legal detonation. Eleanor listened to him, but she found her eyes drifting to the window. She saw Barnaby chasing a seagull on the grass. She saw the white cottage walls glowing in the late light. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to rush the process. She didn't need to win a fight to feel whole. The transformation wasn't in the legal papers or the restored stone. It was in the way she breathed. She sat back in her chair and felt the solid wood support her spine. She felt the cool air from the open window. She felt a quiet, immovable peace that the city could never have given her. She was complete within herself. The black SUV bounced over the gravel path and came to a stop 20 yards from the iron gate. Robert and Julian stepped out of the vehicle. They were wearing charcoal suits that looked stiff and out of place against the wild green of the cliffside. They stood for a moment and looked at the white cottage and the gleaming tower. Eleanor stood on the porch with Barnaby sitting at her side. She didn't move toward the gate. She watched them walk up the path. Robert stopped at the bottom step and looked up at the restored stone walls. "You've done a remarkable job with the place, Eleanor," Robert said. His voice was warm, the same practiced tone he used with major donors. "We've been so worried about you out here in the cold," Julian added. He didn't look at his mother's face. He was looking at the structural integrity of the lighthouse tower. "At your age, the dampness can't be good for your joints." "We're just being realistic, Mum." Eleanor rested her hand on the wooden railing she had sanded and oiled herself. "I haven't felt this strong in 40 years, she said. Her voice was steady and carried clearly over the sound of the Atlantic. Robert cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. "We're here because we've had some news about the coastal acquisition project. The developers need this specific stretch of land for the resort harbor," Julian said. He reached into his pocket for a leather-bound folder. "We need the deed back to close the deal, Eleanor. It's for the good of the company's future. Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Robert added with a tight smile. "We've already picked out a beautiful luxury condo for you in the city center." Eleanor looked at her husband and her son. She saw the way their eyes scanned the property, already mentally tearing down the lighthouse to make room for a swimming pool. "You didn't come here because you're worried about my health," Eleanor said. "You came here because the title search for the resort revealed a hole in your story." Julian's face went still. "It's a minor clerical error, Mom. A technicality from the 80s. Silas stepped out from the cottage doorway. He was holding the ivory founding document Eleanor had found in the hearth. "It's more than a technicality, Julian," Silas said. He stepped down onto the porch next to Eleanor. The search confirmed that the $12,000 used to start Vance construction was Eleanor's sole inheritance. Under the terms of the trust your father witnessed, she is the sole beneficial owner of the parent company. The silence on the porch was absolute. Robert's face turned the color of wet ash. Eleanor, let's be practical. That was 40 years ago. Things have changed. You were the bookkeeper, Julian snapped, his voice losing its clinical edge. You can't just take over. Eleanor looked at her son. She didn't feel anger. She felt a profound, quiet pity for the man she had raised to be so hollow. I'm not taking over, Julian, she said. I am simply reclaiming what was never yours to give away. The transfer you signed to yourself was legally void the moment the pen touched the paper. You gave me this lighthouse because you thought I was worthless, because you thought the truth was buried deep enough that it wouldn't matter. You were wrong about both. Robert took a step forward, his hands open in a gesture of false peace. Eleanor, we're family. Think about what people will say. I spent 40 years thinking about what people would say. Robert, I spent 40 years building a legacy for two men who didn't exist. She looked at the silver compass on the mantel through the open door. Silas will handle the restructuring of the board in the morning. The company will continue, but the name on the door is going to change. Julian started to speak, his face red and his hands shaking. Eleanor didn't wait for the sentence to finish. She turned and walked back into her home. The heavy oak door clicked shut. 1 year after the morning she arrived at the iron gate, the Blackwood Lighthouse was no longer a secret. The white stone tower gleamed against the blue of the Atlantic. Eleanor Vance sat at the oak kitchen table, the surface covered in the payroll ledgers for the Blackwood Maritime Cooperative. The village had a new schoolhouse and a fleet of repaired boats. The funding hadn't come from a government grant. It had come from the restructuring of a construction empire that now bore the name Miller Vance. Robert and Julian were no longer in the glass tower in the city. They were living in a modest apartment, stripped of the assets they had tried to steal. Eleanor didn't check her phone for their calls. She didn't look for their apologies. She focused on the numbers in front of her. Barnaby lay in a patch of sunlight on the honey-colored floor. His grey muzzle was resting on his paws. He didn't limp when he stood up to walk to his water bowl. Eleanor reached for the silver compass on the mantel. The glass face was still cracked. The needle was pointed north, perfectly aligned with the lighthouse tower. She held the cold metal in her palm and looked out at the horizon. You were right, Dad, she whispered to the empty room. The light stays on. She placed the compass back in its spot and returned to her work. She was still here. The story of Eleanor Vance proves that true ownership is not found in a signature on a deed. It proves that justice is a patient force that waits for the person who refuses to be erased. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, from the people you worked a lifetime to protect, you are not alone. Leave one word in the comments describing the justice Eleanor reclaimed, because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. Your value is never determined by the greed of others, but by the strength of the foundation you build for yourself. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their legacy is not a gift to be given, but a right to be defended. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.